Club.
I'm Autumn, I'm the president.
I'm Remy, I'm the treasurer.
I'm Mario, logistics officer.
Yeah, and then welcome to Cannabis and Spirituality.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Ancient roots.
Ancient Roots.
Spirituality.
Cannabis and Spirituality with Chris Bennett.
Yeah.
He's going to be giving a presentation today. So yeah.
All right.
Ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm Chris Bennett. I've been researching and writing about the role of cannabis in magic and religion since about 1990. I got interested in cannabis after finding out about the many industrial applications of cannabis under industrial hemp. I was living out on the west coast of Vancouver Island at that time in a small logging town, and there was starting to be a lot of controversy about old growth logging of the forest. About half the trees go to pulp and paper. And when I found out about 1 acre of hemp could produce as much paper as 4 acres of trees over the same 20-year period, without having to take down all those old growth forests, I saw what I thought was a solution for the issue of jobs versus the environment. And I started promoting hemp products, and was actually the first person to commercially produce hemp seed food in North America. I had a business, Mama Indica's Hemp Seed Treats, and sold hemp paper pads, hemp cloth all over North America. Also at that time, I started a group, Patriotic Canadians for Hemp, promoting the industrial uses. And around that time as well, I had this really powerful religious experience one night using cannabis. And in trying to understand that, I started researching the role of cannabis in a variety of different religions, anything I could come across spiritually. I would start filing it. I started writing articles, and then slowly started working towards books. And these are some of the books I've written. This is Green Gold, The Tree of Life, Marijuana and Magic and Religion. This came out in 1995. It has a foreword by Jack Herer, who's actually kind of the grandfather of the hemp movement. His book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes, Hemp and the Marijuana Conspiracy, introduced all the industrial applications of hemp back to things, making for paper, for cloth. You can move away from soil depleting cotton using, organic hemp. You can produce paints and oils from its, even fuel from its seed oils and its biomass stalks and stuff. Variety of uses that could really, change things around, move. Wide variety of, it was like an overview of what everything I could find at that time. This is before the internet really got going. So this was all library books and university books, going to universities and stuff and researching this stuff. And I, identified a role for cannabis, in a variety of religions and a variety of cultures. There's an actual role for cannabis in things like Taoism in China, in Hinduism, Sikhism, Shinto in Japan, in the Islamic religions, and Judaism as well, and possibly Christianity, as I've suggested in some of my books, and I'll get into that in more detail later. When I was researching this book, one of the things I came across was the work of this anthropologist and etymologist, Sula Bennett. There was this Hebrew terms, canna and cannabosum, that identified cannabis that appeared originally in the Old Testament. And this is like Sula Bennett, just to give you some idea that it's not some fellow pothead that I know or something like that. She was a well-known and respected anthropologist. And after I found out about it, I looked at these references. She pointed to 5 different references in the Old Testament that were references to cannabis. And the initial ones were positive, but then the last one was negative. And so I was trying to figure out what happened. I didn't really have a lot of familiarity with the Bible. And so I spent a number of years with a friend of mine with a degree in religious studies and who could read Hebrew and stuff. And we put together this book here, Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible. and we understood the context of these references and why it went from positive to negative. And this is something that later was verified by archaeological evidence, as I'll discuss later. And so this came out in 2001. In 2010, Cannabis in the Soma Solution. I don't know how much you know about the history of Soma and Hayoma, but these were the sacred drinks. Soma was the sacred drink of the Vedic religion, which led to the Hindu religion, which is still with us. And Hayoma was the sacred drink of the Avestan religion, which led to Zoroastrianism, which is also still with us. And both of these drinks were related. They came from an earlier culture that split in two different directions, but because of the similarities in languages and mythologies and the similarities in these drinks, Hayoma and Soma, we know they originated in an earlier identical religion. My next book after that was at a whopping 777 pages, was Liber 420, Cannabis, Magical Herbs, and the Occult. And there's a fascinating history of cannabis in the occult world, in alchemy and magic and stuff like that. The grimoires like Sefer Raziel, Liber Salamanus, and the Picatrex, which goes back to the 10th century, refer to hashish and cannabis for various magical rituals. And alchemists use it for the production of quintessences, which were sacred elixirs. And more recently, this book here, Cannabis, Lost Sacrament of the Ancient World. And this one here goes over the same stuff in my book, Sex, Drugs, Violence, in the Bible. This is ginger beer, not alcohol beer, just so you know. In light of this really cool archaeological information that came to light in 2020. Now, it seemed like this idea that these Hebrew references to cannabosum identified cannabis were destined to be just an obscure linguistic theory that could never be proved or disproved. However, in 2020, in Israel, an archaeological study came to light of the only known, physically known, Jewish temple site. And this was in Tel Arad, Jerusalem. And in Tel Arad, Jerusalem, they found two altars in a small inner temple room of the temple there. It was like a size of a broom closet, just big enough to hotbox. And they found two altars in there. One of them was used for burning frankincense, and the other one was used for burning cannabis resins. And we know that the archaeologists involved say it was actually like hashish or something like that. It wasn't like leaf cannabis or flowers. It was like prepared cannabis resins. And so people would have got very high inside of this oracular chamber, and it was a place where you would go in to hear the voice of God. So those are the books that I've written. Let's talk a little bit about the history of cannabis and where it all starts, you know. And cannabis is like really old, a really old relationship with humanity. Archaeological evidence, because it's multi-use, it shows up in a variety of cultures in different ways. Based on archaeological evidence of hemp rope found in Czechoslovakia, they believe there that it started being used around 24,000 years ago. And then we have evidence of hemp cloth in Taiwan going back about the 10th century BC. 10,000 years ago, not the 10th century, 10,000 years ago BC. And a similar evidence of hemp cloth turns up in Catalhayak in Turkey, 9,000 BC. So this is particularly old. You got to think these two cultures, Taiwan and they're not people that would have been in communication. So this is independent use, already established. People were growing it, producing fibers from it, and possibly using it in other ways. In regards to ritual use and using it for psychoactive purposes, evidence indicates that it was used in funerary rituals in Ukraine going back to about 5,500 BCE. 3,500 BCE, so 5,500 years ago. And there we found it at the site of a funerary site, a burial site. And they believed it was burnt and used in funerary rituals at that time. And this is a practice. This group here where it was discovered with were known as the Proto-Indo-Europeans. And Indo-European language is the root language of Sanskrit, German, English, French, the Avestan language, just like a whole whack of languages. And so this is before the Indo-European language was formed. This was the group before that the Indo-European language it came out of and split off into all these different directions around the world and gave us many of our modern languages. And it's believed that the root word for cannabis, canap, originated here like 5,500 years ago. These people were also the first to domesticate the horse. And it's believed that hemp ropes played a pivotal role in the domestication of the horse as well. And this is what enabled it. And their descendants, these people's descendants, the Scythians, were these nomadic culture that burned cannabis in teepee-like structures, built a little teepee-like thing, not that big, big enough to put your head in, and they burned cannabis in a brazier and catch all the smoke in there. They didn't have pipes or anything like that. Pipes and bowls and bongs and joints and things like that came much, much later. But people would hotbox burnt cannabis in enclosed spaces. That's how it was often consumed then, as well. The Scythians as well took it in drinks as well. And so, as well as this older Indo-European evidence that I was talking about, burnt cannabis, going back 5,000 years in Spain, cannabis was being mixed with wine. And they found a very interesting burial site there with either high-ranking priestesses or high-ranking female royalty. And the burial site there had a plate that had both cannabis resins on it and wine resins. And we find similar stuff with the Scythians. We first heard about them burning cannabis from Herodotus. He wrote about it in the 5th century. He described a funerary ritual where they burnt cannabis and went inside a tent and came out howling. And then later on in 1940s, an archaeologist in Russia found a Scythian tomb, and he found the actual braziers that they used with burnt cannabis seeds and the tent structures and the carpets that were wrapped around the tent. So we know that Herodotus' account was more than a mere mythology. And the Scythians as well, they drank cannabis. We know this from golden goblets from the time period that had residues of both cannabis and opium in them. So this is all really, really old stuff, right? And it's believed the Scythians and these Indo-European cultures passed this use around the ancient world. And we find that one of the groups that we know that they were in contact with were the Zoroastrians. And the Zoroastrians, they took cannabis in infused wines. And there's numbers of stories of Zoroastrian figures drinking these infused wines. It was so powerful that it would knock them out for a day. And then they would come back and then they would retell their vision. And it was thought to have something that really happened. Zoroastrianism is a very important religion in the way that it affected the cosmologies of both Judaism and Christianity. Things like heaven and hell, an end of the world, all these things were in Zoroastrianism first and made their way into Christianity and Judaism. And figures like Ardu Virath was given 7 cups, golden cups of this infused wine. And he described his afterlife journey where he saw both heaven and hell. And a king that Zoroaster is said to have initiated in this manner, Vishtaspa, he had a vision at the end of the world that was called the Oracle of Hystaspius. And it predicted the downfall of Rome and became prohibited literature. And it's thought to have influenced the composition of the book of Revelation in the Bible. And these groups also made it into India. And India as well has a very long and well-established history of cannabis. Today is actually the holy day of Shiva in India, Maha Shivaratri. And Shiva's worship is thought to go back to the Stone Age. And bong is Shiva's holy plant. It's thought to come from his own body. And sadhus and holy men in India for centuries, going back to ancient times, partake of, here's an antique chillum. A chillum's like this, full of ganja, as they refer to cannabis. And drink it in an infusion called bong, which is also used in festivals like the the Festival of Colors, a harvest festival where they throw paint and colored powders on each other in this really joyful, colorful celebration. But yeah, so Shiva's worship goes back to the Stone Age, and this is thought to have, his use of cannabis is thought to have been derived from this earlier Soma cult that I was referring to, and the Zoroastrian use as well is thought to have been identified through this earlier Hayoma use, which I identified as well. So I should get into that. Now, this, as I mentioned, was a sacred drink that was used in both the Avestan religion and the Vedic religion. So these go back thousands of years. Some of the oldest religious literature we have are in these texts. And Soma was a drink, a god, the moon in the sky. And there's been many theories about what Soma was. Popularly, R. Gordon Wasson's book Soma suggested that the fly agaric mushroom was this sacred beverage. But there's a lot of dispute over that. And the Vedic descriptions of Soma in the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda describe it as a green and purple tree or plant, and describe it being prepared in a manner that's very similar to the way that bong is prepared in the cult of Shiva. And so this seems to be a likely thing. And there's a lot of archaeological evidence to back this up. Victor Serianati, a Russian archaeologist, was digging around in the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, which is in Afghanistan. And he found 3 temple sites. And these temples were about the size of a football field. And inside these temple sites, he found an area that he suggested was for the preparation of a sacred beverage. And he believed this was the Hayoma. And in the gypsum of bowls that were used, they were able to identify cannabis and ephedra. And this is really interesting. However, other archaeologists later on were unable to reproduce these results that Serianati did, because the material, he was like just a poor, Russia didn't have the money for archaeology that, say, North American or European archaeologists done, and stuff would get dug up and just get left out in the sun, and it deteriorated. But there's other archaeological evidence that backs up Serianati's theory, and some of this is in China. Now, China has a long, long history of cannabis use. I already mentioned the use in Taiwan, which is not far from there. But Taoists in China, Taoists were known to use cannabis for sort of astral traveling type of endeavors, and also considered an elixir of immortality. And there's a 2,500-year-old poem, first a yin, then a yang. No one knows what I do. Jade buds of holy hemp for the one that lives apart. But the Taoists weren't, and the Han Chinese, that's the indigenous Chinese, weren't the only ones in China using it. Indo-European groups came into China around 2000 BC, and they were known to be there around 400, till around 400 BC, when the Han Chinese, the indigenous Chinese, chased them out of the area. And a number of archaeological digs of Indo-European sites in China have discovered mummified remains of Indo-Europeans. It was really controversial at the time, because it rewrites the history of China, that China had that before. They thought that many things like horseback riding, making of bronze, that they had come to independently. However, this culture, Indo-Europeans had been doing these things for a long time, and now we know that Indo-Europeans were in this area from 2000 to 400 BC. This has also changed what we know about trade in the ancient world. It was thought the Silk Road formed around 100 BC, but now we know that it was at least a millennia earlier than that. And one of the items on the Silk Road would have been cannabis products. And we know these people grew quality cannabis because 3 tombs have been discovered in the region where preserved cannabis, a really dry, cold environment. And so it really preserved, usually, like vegetable matter just gets deteriorated, disappears, if it's burnt, it can help because it's carbonized. So in the case of the Scythian braziers, it was burnt. And so we had burnt seeds and carbonized, and that lasted archaeology. But in the Chinese case, we had actual vegetative matter that was still green. And there was 3 tombs found. One had about 1 kilo of cannabis, female cannabis, in a tomb with a shaman. It was believed to have been a shaman. And another tomb had a bouquet of female cannabis strewn across. a body, and another tomb had cannabis mixed with millet, and so it must have been used as some sort of preparation. As well, they found wooden braziers, much like the Scythian bronze braziers, that were used for burning cannabis. And they found like dozens of these at these burial sites. So here again, we see the same sort of funerary ritual, which was taking place in Ukraine and Romania and places like that, 3,000 years earlier. These ones in China are thought to be about 700 BCE, right? Yeah, and so this is like in China, they refer to cannabis by the name of huma, which is thought to mean either Scythian cannabis or fire cannabis. And this is this specific type of cannabis that was associated with these Indo-Europeans, because these Indo-Europeans were part of the Scythian trade routes. I described earlier the Scythians being nomadic and traveling all around and spreading cannabis knowledge. We know the Scythians were involved with these people, and that these people were involved with the archaeological evidence I discussed earlier from the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, because archaeological evidence from both sites has been found at either sites, which shows that there was an item of trade. And the Scythians, who would have been the people that brought it back and forth, one of the names they were known of at that time was the Heoma Varga, the Heomer gatherers. And so they were described as those who burnt Heoma as well as drank it. So this fits with the trade route going into the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex. And so through linguistic changes between Avestan and Vedic language, this became, Heoma became Soma, the Huma, the Chinese name Huma became Heoma, and then further linguistic changes into India, it became Soma. And this is a source of a lot of different religions grew out of the Vedic religions and the Zoroastrian religions. For instance, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism can all be traced back to this earlier Vedic religion, different variations of them, in the same way that the Islamic and Christianity religions can trace their religions back to the Jewish religions, right? Now, I'll get into this archaeological evidence from Tel Arad. So this is all say that stuff there. That's like 3,000 years ago. The Chinese evidence of the braziers and stuff, that's like 2,700 years ago. But 2,800 years ago in Tel Arad, Jerusalem, people were burning cannabis at a holy site that I described earlier. Just give me 1 second. I'll get a picture of the temple site. And so this is the inner temple site. Now, this would have had a roof and walls on it, but it's all fallen apart. And on the smaller altar, this is where cannabis would have been burnt, and it's only about 2 feet tall. It's not very big. On the other altar that you see there is about 3 feet tall. So you can imagine the size of the room would probably be like 4 by 8 and an enclosed little area. And so it could get contain smoke pretty well in there. It would be pretty intense with a whole bunch of hashish burning in there. And we know this was a Jewish site because a Hebrew site, holy site, because they found an inscription that said House of Yahweh. Right at the site, right? And Yahweh is the biblical God, Jehovah, that we know as Jehovah. So this is pretty radical thing because it's the actual only Jewish temple site ever discovered. Now, this was kind of a shock to a lot of Hebrew scholars because were they getting high? You know what I mean? Was this the same practice that was being practiced at the main temple in Jerusalem? And the evidence indicates it is. A lot of scholars say. Other ones say this is an indication of heretical practices. And what I'm saying is they're both right, and that's what these Hebrew references to Cana and Cannabasum also indicate. And I'm going to go over these 5 references in the Old Testament or the Torah or the Tanakh or whichever way you want to refer to it, the Hebrew Bible. And discuss a little bit about these references in context and how it relates to this archaeological discovery at Tel Arad, and that Tel Arad confirms the linguistic theory of Sula Bennett. And it's pretty radical stuff, I think, because I think that when you understand the role of cannabis in the formative period of religion, it's as much a threat to fundamental religion as Darwin's theory of evolution was to the myths of Genesis. Because what it shows is the plant-based shamanic origins of religion. And that's a radical thing when, the idea is that, God came down from the heavens and spoke to Moses in a burning bush. It's a pretty radical alternative theory to say, well, maybe there was something more to that burning bush. So these are the 5 references to cannabis, according to Sula Bennett. The first of these occurs in Exodus 30:23. And the Lord said to Moses, take the following spices, 500 shekels of liquid myrrh, half as much of fragrant cinnamon, 250 shekels of fragrant canna, balsam. And so this is the Hebrew word. Canna is the Hebrew word that Sula Bennett said identified cannabis, and balsam refers to fragrances. Canna basically means cane, and appears in other areas of the Bible. Sometimes it's just a generic term for a reed or cane, but in these 5 references, other scholars agree it's something really specific, not general. We're in a recipe here, right? And so every time that Moses was to speak to the Lord, he would go in this small tent-like structure called the tent of the meeting, and he would place some incense on the altar, and then he would pour the cannabis oil that he used on the altar of incense. He'd also put this on his body, and THC is fatty soluble. And then he would speak to the Lord in a pillar of smoke over the altar. And so the only time that he was talked to the Lord in the story is when he went in the tent of the meeting and smoke was pouring out of this altar. This is a similar situation to what we see in Tel Arad. There's a small enclosed light chamber, and they go in and they burn the cannabis. There's standing stones there that represent the god. And they would hear the voice of God. It would come back. What are we going to do when a voice would come back with advice? Now, the next reference occurs in the Song of Songs, which is supposedly written by Solomon, who built the first temple in Jerusalem, and would have, some people believe that he would have been the one that built this place in Tel Arad as well. And in the Song of Songs, we read, "How delightful is your love, my sister, my bride. Your love is much better than wine, and the fragrance of your ointments than all spices. Your lips, my bride, drip sweetness like honeycomb, honey and milk under the tongue. And the fragrance of your garments is like the aroma of Lebanon. My sister, my bride, you are a garden looked up, a spring enclosed, a fountain sealed. Your branches are an orchard of pomegranates, with a choice of fruits, with henna and nard and saffron, with canna and cinnamon, with every kind of frankincense tree, with myrrhs and aloes, and with all the finest spices." Now, this gets really interesting because Solomon was said to be a devotee of Yahweh, but he was also accused of worshiping the goddess. And it was said that he burnt incense on the high places to the goddess. And some scholars believe that the Song of Songs actually represents a time period when the biblical God, Yahweh, had a bride, Asherah. And there's archaeological evidence that relates to this. And Tel Arad is actually part of that archaeological evidence. In Tel Arad, they not only found an inscription that said the house of Yahweh, but they also found these. I lost my screen here. Sorry. Just 1 second here. Okay. I don't know how you can see me. I'm not seeing you there. Okay. Well, I guess you can. Oh, here I know. Here I go. I got it. And there we go. Sorry about that. So this is a figurine of Asherah, and they found a number of figurines like this at this site in Tel Arad. as well, there's been inscriptions found throughout the Holy Land that refer to Yahweh and his Asherah, and Asherah was his wife in these inscriptions, and both written and depicted in a variety of different sites. And she ended up becoming prohibited. This is before, like, the Bible as we know it was written in place. This is kind of the background story of it. And it's really a powerful suppression, because when you think about how the suppression of women is one thing, but like when you're talking about, the suppression of cannabis is one thing. When we talk about the suppression of women, taking away like the goddess and just making it a male god, that has an effect on cultures for millennia. And so it's really wild. So then the next reference we find is in Isaiah. And it says, I have not burdened you with offerings or wearied you with frankincense. You have not brought me any sweet canna with money or satisfied me with the fat of your sacrifices, but you have burdened me with your sins. You have wearied me with your iniquities. So here in this reference here, he's getting upset with Isaiah because he has not brought canna to him. And we see it's mentioned with frankincense. And this was also the case with the Song of Songs. The canna and frankincense are mentioned together. And this is what was found at Tel Arad: cannabis on one altar and frankincense on the other altar. Now, Isaiah gets heck from God there for not bringing the canna, but bringing his sins and iniquities. But in Isaiah 6, they describe this scene where the house is filled with smoke, and he's inside the temple. Then it says, then one of the seraphims flew unto me with a live coal in a hand, which he had taken off the altar, and he laid it upon my lips. And lo, my iniquities are taken away, and my sins purged. So we see this temple scene where the seraphim goes over to the altar and with tongs picks up a coal, holds it up to Isaiah's mouth where he could take a big hit, almost like hot knives or something like that. And his sins and iniquities are taken away. And so when he didn't bring the cannabis and the frankincense, God's pissed off and says, you burden me with my sins and iniquities. However, when he takes a hit of the burning coal from the burning incense altar, his sins and iniquities are purged. Now, the next reference occurs in Jeremiah 6:20, and this is where things go south for cannabis and its relationship, and this is really where the end of goddess worship and Asherah takes place, and where this is about the 9th century, right, BCE. And one of the reasons that this altar in Tel Arad was so well preserved was because they had been tipped over and buried in a day, and a new floor built right over top of them. And so it just totally preserved them because of this. And this is thought to have gone on during reforms by a king that we know historically existed, Hezekiah, and he's in the Bible. And he went around destroying all the Asherah sites, and he's described as going into the temple of the Jerusalem and pulling out the Asherah from the temple of Jerusalem, as well as the brazen serpent that Moses made, because the people of Israel were burning incense to it. And Asherah was also known as the Lady of the Serpent. So the serpent would have been her symbol as well. And it's believed that the menorah, the sacred tree symbol of Judaism, originated with Asherah as well, because in the ancient depictions of Yahweh and Asherah or Asherah, we have a menorah-like symbols appearing in there as a sacred tree. So in Jeremiah 6:20, when this is all going on, we read, what do I care about frankincense from Sheba, or sweet-smelling canna from a distant land? Your burnt offerings are not acceptable. Your sacrifices do not please me. So before what was holy is all of a sudden now totally unholy and totally rejected. And we find out that this is tied up with Jeremiah 44. And in Jeremiah 44, this is when Jerusalem fell, when the Assyrians and Babylonians and other cultures came along and overthrew Israel and put them into captivity and stuff, right? And Jeremiah in Jeremiah 44, he blames the fall of Jerusalem on the people of Israel, mostly the women, burning incense to the Queen of Heaven. And he condemns them for it. And they say, well, what? When we were burning incense to the Queen of Heaven, we had everything good, because that was true. That was at the peak of their kingdom. This was the fall of their kingdom when they stopped. And so in Jeremiah 44, he blames the complete fall of Jerusalem on the fall of the Queen of Heaven. This is when the temple at Tel Arad was destroyed, and the altars were buried. And this all had to do with the suppression of these earlier worshippers of both Yahweh and Asherah in unison, along with other deities. It was polytheistic. They weren't monotheistic, they were polytheistic. And these polytheistic people used cannabis in rituals for inspiration. And this was suppressed because what happened with monotheism was as much a political reformation as a religious one, because they were under attack by these much larger kingdoms. And in those days, there was no division between politics and religion. So trying to control the population that was divided into all these different religious cults was really difficult. But when they got it down to one God and one place of worship in Jerusalem, that consolidated the power and the wealth of the kingdom in a way that they could deal with these larger kingdoms. And there was no room for prophets to be inhaling the vapors of cannabis or possibly other psychoactives as well, and coming up with new revelations about it. It became a religion more about trade and control and how much you paid to the king and the temple and that sort of stuff. And then the final reference is in Ezekiel, and it says, and casks of wine from whose all they exchange for your wares, wrought iron, cassia, and canner were bartered for your merchandise. And the archaeologists at Tel Arad say cannabis came from a distant land. It was imported into Tel Arad, and this is what Jeremiah said as well, that it came in as a from a foreign offering. Now, interestingly, we find a similar use to this, and almost an identical use, similar name, in Assyria, where cannabis was burned, and Babylon, where cannabis was burned to Ishtar and Inanna and Asherah and other Near Eastern goddesses. We have actual references to cannabis in their cults. And in those cults, cannabis, in Assyria and Babylonia, cannabis was known as Kanaba, which is phonetically similar to Cannabosum and Kana. And it was used in a similar way, both as an incense and a topical ointment. Assyrian references refer to how this topical ointment could open one's ear to God, right? So that's pretty powerful stuff. Now, this may leak into Christianity. The Tel Arad stuff's not the only archaeological evidence for cannabis. We have another archaeological site in Bet Shemesh, Jerusalem. And in Bet Shemesh, they found the remains of a 14-year-old girl who died, who's pregnant, and who died from complication in pregnancy. But they've been using topical cannabis on her, as well as burning hashish inside where the tomb where she ended up being entombed. And her mummified remains were being used. Now in Hebrew, the one who received the holy anointing oil, which was the high priest or the king, was known as the Messiah. And in Greek translation, this became Christ. And we know that Jesus baptized none of his disciples, but he did send out the 12 apostles with oil to cast out demons and heal the sick. Now, early Christianity had a variety of sects. We know Christianity through the Roman Catholic, the Bible, the New Testament. But up until about the 4th century, there were a variety of different Christian sects, now known under the collective name of Gnosticism. And the Gnostics were more about experience rather than faith. And one of the main points of contention between the Gnostics and what became the Roman Catholic Church was anointing versus water baptism. And a Gnostic text we say there's fire only in the anointing oil and only water in the baptism. And through the anointing oil, they're initiated in unfading bliss, and they apply it for a number of medical conditions, such as straightening the crooked limbs. So we know that, cannabis has medical uses and stuff as well. And Gnostic texts even describe Jesus using an incense that contained a wonder in a ritual with both men and women, and infusing wine with branches. So there's strong indication that these Gnostic sects of the first few centuries were using cannabis and likely other psychoactive substances. And when the Roman Catholic Church fully took power, they were suppressed along with all the competing pagan religions that were in existence at that time, and the people were limited to the Roman Catholic version of Christianity, which all our modern Christian religions kind of sprouted out of. In the Islamic religion, we have Fakirs and Sufis that use cannabis for mystic purposes, but there's also some interesting stuff about even Muhammad. The Dazapan from India, thought to be written in the 16th century, describes Muhammad making bong with some sadhus. They have some cannabis. They're trying to prepare bong, and they don't have anything to strain it through. This is this drink I was describing that was used in India. And so Muhammad, they use his turban, and it turns his turban green, and that becomes the color of Muhammad's tribe. So that goes back to the 16th or 17th century. But other scholars have pointed to the similarity, like Islam was influenced by a number of religions, Judaism, Christianity, but also Zoroastrian religion as well. There's the Persian influence is really well known in the Islamic religion. And in Muhammad's famous night flight, he's described as drinking a cup of sacred water before he has his trip on the horse with the human head up to the moon or wherever. And this is thought to have been derived from these earlier Zoroastrian accounts that I described earlier, such as the tale of Ardu Viraf, where after drinking a cannabis infusion, he had his visions of heaven and hell. And the Islamic stuff makes its way into Europe because the Psychedelics, which is kind of the foundational grimoire of the Western magical tradition, which came out in the 12th century, is thought to be a Latin translation of a 10th century Islamic magic book, the Gayat al-Hakim. And in the Psychedelics, there's a recipe for hashish infused incense, which is burnt under certain ritual techniques, and you speak to the spirit of the moon in the pillar of smoke over the hashish. And we see a continuation of such use of cannabis in the magical tradition going up into the 16th century in grimoires such as the Sefer Raziel, Liber Salomonis, and the Book of Oberon, and there's a couple of other ones as well. And here it's used with magic mirrors. Magic mirrors were these black opaque mirrors, and you would stare in them until you saw a vision. And apparently cannabis was used a lot of times in conjunction with these magic mirrors. I guess they helped with the visionary properties of seeing a vision in these mirrors. This is thought to be a technique that goes back to much more ancient times. And in alchemy, cannabis was used in quintessences, which was thought to be the fifth essence, kind of like the soul of a plant. And alchemists would take wine, they would bury it, it would separate, and they get a clearer liquid, and they'd save the clearer liquid and get id of the dark liquid. And they would repeat this process 5 times, getting a fairly pure form of alcohol from that. Once they had this pure form of alcohol, they would infuse plants into the alcohol, thinking that they were absorbing the soul of the plant into this chemical heaven. It was basically tincturing, right? But they, alchemy is kind of like magic and science mixed together. It's what science grew out of, right? And early techniques, so they would keep loading up this infusion with cannabis or other plants and pull it out, put it back in again, repeat this a number of times until they got a really potent infusion. And Paracelsus, one of the more well-known alchemists, he actually has a surviving recipe for one of these quintessences, which was used to treat epilepsy. And cannabis and epilepsy treatments go way back. There's Assyrian references to Hand of Ghost, which are thought to be references to epilepsy, and cannabis was used to treat that. And this could have also been among the miracles used by Jesus with the holy oil, because epilepsy was thought to be demonic possession up until medieval times. And so cannabis appears in recipes for these quintessences in a number of alchemical texts attributed to well-known alchemists. And this all led to science, and the Royal Society, which is the foundational academy of science, they had a deep interest in this type of stuff. And Robert Hooke, one of the founding scientists, wrote extensively on cannabis, and they imported cannabis from India for experimental purposes, because they found the European cannabis was basically innate. It didn't really have any couldn't really, so poor quality, you couldn't really get high off of it. But so the royal science itself, kind of grew out of this idea of like taking the soul out of the plant. Then it became the rationalization was, there's some sort of chemical activity, and the separation of chemicals and breaking down of things really all started with alchemy, and this is the foundation of our modern science as well. And we see cannabis in the medieval occult period. There was a whole whack of interest in hashish. We know figures like Helena Blavatsky, a well-known occult figure, had mystical experiences on cannabis. Aleister Crowley, another well-known occult figure, he wrote extensively. He wrote a 90-page essay, The Psychology of Hashish, trying to break it down in a scientific matter with yogic explanations. And Gurdjieff as well experimented with hashish. I don't think there would have been an occult revival in the 19th or 20th century without the influence of cannabis. It was so widespread amongst occultists, and in the literary world, we had, in the 19th century, Le Club de Hashishins, and it had authors in it that partook of hashish, such as Victor Hugo, Alexander Dumas, Théophile Gautier, Balzac, de Nerval, and these authors, 175 years ago, their works are still in print. People are still reading them, and they got inspiration from cannabis, as many artists and people do today. So that's kind of a long ramble. Maybe we should open it up to questions.
To start with, I put one in the chat, but you kind of answered it. But what do you think, or what's the scholarship on the existence of the 2 incense shrines at Telerad?
I'm sorry, I'm not really getting the question.
Here, I'll go closer. What I was saying is that given the presence of 2 incense shrines at Telerad,
Okay.
Yeah.
There was 2 altars as well as 2 standing stones. Only one standing stone was survived, though one of them must have been destroyed. But it seemed like there was a place for a second standing stone, and it was probably the combined worship of Yahweh and Asherah inside that temple. I'm assuming from descriptions with Cannabosum and from the temple site, the frankincense was burned to Yahweh, and the Canna was particularly sacred to Asherah. And I say this because of the association of cannabis use with other Near Eastern goddesses, because of similarities in their mythologies and the way they were worshipped. It's thought that a variety of these Near Eastern goddesses, and this includes Ishtar, Inanna, Ishara, who specifically has a cannabis ointment, hymn which describes her cannabis ointment. They all have very similar mythologies and forms of worship. They all have transvestites in their cults worshiping them. And they have this cannabis stuff and weaving and stuff. They also found weaving was sacred to the cult of Asherah. And another archaeological find was they found a site where they believed that the sacred weaving was done, and they found cannabis fibers at this site as well, believed to be another Asherah site, but here for weaving. And one of the things Hezekiah did was remove the women who were weaving for Asherah inside the temple, right? So I believe that the 2 altars were because of this combined worship of a god and a goddess together. And some scholars believe that the whole Eden mythology is a reversal of this earlier mythology. and that Eve is representative of Asherah. There's a name Hawa in Hebrew for Eve that is also applied to Asherah. And the sacred prohibited trees could well be identified as cannabis. You know, as soon after they took them and their eyes became enlightened, they weave clothes. Is what it says in the Bible, right? And the serpent is the one that seduced them. And Hezekiah pulled the brazen serpent out of the temple because the people of Israel were burning incense to it. So there's a lot of it, and this is something I go into great detail in my books. You know, I'm giving like a really broad overview. It probably sounds so sensational, guy. What's this guy talking about? Where's he getting this stuff from? But my books, as Ariel can tell you, are very, very detailed and referenced. And you can also, I posted links to my blog in the chat here that you could go to if you want to kind of get finer details about some of this stuff, and you know where this stuff is about the arc. If you could search cannabis in Telerad, or you could search Asherah, and you'll find out. You know, it's nothing new that I'm coming up with, that God had a wife. This is well known by biblical scholars today. When I first wrote about it in the 90s, it was considered pretty radical. Not everybody accepted it, but I was surprised when I worked on my more recent book how accepted. This is like, you know, mainstay of academic studies of the Bible, that God had a wife and that this was all suppressed is pretty standard, the standard view now. And cannabis was wrapped up with this, you know what I mean? It was the tree of life in the ancient world, and it was sacred. You know, it's like when you combine that and the influence of that with this Soman Haoma stuff, you're talking about virtually all the main existing religions that have survived through the time have some sort of connection with it. Like in Buddhism, there's ancient descriptions of Buddha surviving on one hemp seed a day under the Bodhi tree. And in Tibetan Buddhism in the 10th century, there's all sorts of texts like the Mahakala Tantra and the Tara Tantra that refer to cannabis, recipes for cannabis, refer to its spiritual use for yogis and stuff like that. So there as well, you know what I mean? And here it is again, showing up right now in this pivotal time in our world, you know, where we're in a really bad spot right now. Is like, you know, Trump's like drill baby drill, and the planet's on fire. You know, we have these huge fires going on. We have major hurricanes happening from global warming and climate change. And here's this plant that was used by our ancestors showing up here in our time. People, you know, not long ago thought that cannabis was something that people discovered in the hippie era or the jazz age. You know, they didn't realize just the extensive history that we have with this plant and what a formative part of our thinking and culture it is. You know, literature, science, religion, medicine, food, clothing, you know, everything. And cannabis is here again, man, offering us an alternative way to do things without burning our planet down and polluting our world.
Yeah, kind of going off on that. I don't think you mentioned it, like, you know, today, but I've definitely heard you talk about before, like how you connect that with, I think it's at the end of the book of Revelation.
Well, this goes back to this religious experience. And I'm always hesitant to tell this story because I feel it kind of discredits me. And before I tell it, you know, I'll say this. My view on the book of Revelation is that it was written in the first century about the Roman Empire and what was happening with Judaism and Christianity and the Roman Empire. You can worship whoever you wanted in the Roman Empire, but you had to have an image of Caesar inside your temple and recognize Caesar as the representative of your God. And this was, you know, apostasy to the Hebrews because you can't have any graven images and shit, right? You know, inside the temple. And so it was a real point of contention, right? And so the references to the beast and this type of stuff in Revelations, they're all references to emperor worship and the situation in Israel at that time. However, myself, in the early 90s, I had this, like 1989, 90, I had this really powerful religious experience. And it was brought about by a series of events and the use of cannabis. So the first of these was in Canada, where I'm now on the east coast of Canada. There was a major controversy about this Catholic-run orphanage in the 80s, Mount Cashel Orphanage. And kids that had been in this orphanage grew up and they started reporting that they were molested. And this was the first time that this type of stuff was getting talked about in the press openly. And I was like, Jesus, what the hell is going on there? You know, and I had never read the Bible. I wasn't really interested in religion. I thought, I'm going to get the Bible and read it. And at that time, I was like a surfer on Vancouver Island. I grew weed, and I had this job a few nights a week as a night watchman. You know, I was having a good time, and I would read at night at this job. I didn't really do a lot of work or anything, you know, smoke weed in the lunchroom at the fish plant that I was the night watchman of. And I started reading the Bible, and it was so and so begat so and so. I go, I can't make it. I just tossed it aside in my office and forgot about it. And then there started being a big controversy about the logging in my area, the last old growth rainforest, Clackwood Sound. And environmentalists were showing up. Before that, I hadn't even thought about environmentalism or anything. It wasn't even, people logged and fished. That was just the way it was in those towns. Logging, fishing was a way of life, you know, and nobody was talking about saving trees or anything like that. Then all of a sudden, it all started showing up, and the world media was there as well. And I found out around this time about the industrial uses of hemp. And I thought, okay, you know, the loggers were all like, we need jobs. And I thought, well, here's jobs and here's environment. You know, we can have both. And I started kind of promoting that. Also coinciding with that was the Gulf War in Iraq. And Saddam Hussein had fired a Scud missile into Israel. Because of this, people were comparing him to the last king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, who overthrew the Jews in the Bible at the time of Asherah worship. One day I was in this fish plant and I was smoking a weed. And back in those days, they didn't have the internet or anything. So TV stuff was all in the newspaper, TV guides and stuff. And I saw an advertisement for a sermon by Pat Robertson. And it was Revelations 18, the fall of Babylon. And behind him, he had picture tanks and jets. And Babylon is where Iraq is now, was where Iraq is now. And Saddam Hussein had actually been trying to restore the ancient temple of Babylon and other things, other artifacts, and bring it all back to life. And he really liked the connection to Nebuchadnezzar that people were making. He made a big deal about it. And so I thought, holy shit, I'm going to read the book of Revelation right now. When I was a kid, I'd seen the Omen. And I think getting close to the end of the millennium, everybody is just kind of apocalyptic thinking. So I started reading the book of Revelation. At the beginning of the book, the prophet John, he's given a scroll and he puts it in his mouth. It tastes as sweet as honey. And he swallows it and he turns bitter in his stomach. And then he begins to prophesy. And I was like, what did he eat? You know, he had to eat something before he had this prophecy. What was that all about? And then it described them all wearing sackcloth. And it said, you know, they were given much incense to offer, billowing clouds of incense. And the incense held the prayers of the saints. I was like, oh, this is really trippy stuff. And then I got to the end of the book of Revelation, and it said, on either side of the river of life stood the tree of life, bearing 12 manners of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. And when I read that, I had this feeling like light just poured into me, and that this was a reference to cannabis and hemp. And all these manners of fruit where it's industrial uses, which I was just going over, which we could, you know, make all our fuel from it, all our paints and oils, all our cloth, building products. They're making houses from it right now. You can use it to make really good batteries. You know, there's just an endless amount of uses and possibilities. And its medicine is like miraculous. You know, if you have a child with epilepsy and you're able to treat that epilepsy with cannabis, that's a miracle to you, man. You know, if you're going blind from glaucoma and you're able to treat that glaucoma and reverse the effects of it, that pressure, that's a miracle, man. You know, like, you know, and there's like strong evidence that cannabis can shrink tumors and work for certain types of cancer. The study of cannabis medicine has led to a whole new area of science, the endocannabinoid system. This is the way cannabis works is the psychocannabinoids in cannabis attach themselves to the endocannabinoid system named after cannabis in our own body because they're so molecularly similar. Our body, human mother milk, produces endocannabinoids that feed the baby, that give it nourishment and make it hungry and kind of create a symbiotic relationship between the mother and child. So, you know, when I had that, I was like totally tripping out. I called my wife up at the time, my first wife, and she thought I was having some sort of mental breakdown. And so the next day I got up and I was like, was there anything to that, or was I just tripping? And I thought, well, I was looked out at these clear-cut mountains around my home, and I thought the hemp stuff for sure is real. That's for, and I thought if there's anything to my religious experience, somebody somewhere else will have had something similar happen. And so this led to my path that I've been on for this last 35 years of documenting the history of cannabis in different religions and stuff. And I think that although I realized that the book of Revelation was written for the first century, at the same time, it's become a collective archetypal symbol to humanity. And, like, for instance, in Trump's government is full of evangelical Christians, Christian Zionists, who believe so powerfully in the book of Revelation that they are committed to restoring the whole kingdom of Israel, because that's the only way the Messiah comes back in Revelation, is after the kingdom of Israel is restored. And they're actively trying to fulfill biblical prophecy. And that's on the conscious level. And so perhaps on some sort of unconscious level, because so many people believe in it, something is being projected back outside of it. And as I described in regards to that Eden mythology and how it's based on Asherah, who had a sacred tree, which was a big part of her worship. A lot of the imagery of Asherah is involved around this sacred tree symbol that I would say is a reference to cannabis. And it was her sacred tree of life is how it is described. So there is a kind of a connection there. And what I think I tapped into was some sort of collective memory or something like that of this sacred history that kind of was just enough to kind of give me a key to open a door. And once I opened it, the boom, 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 things just started falling out into place. And I'm saying, after 35 years of research, and I approach scholars and things. I definitely try to keep my biases out of my research. You know what I mean? And I'll tell people about my experience because it can reveal a bias. But this stuff about archaeological evidence of cannabis in Colorado, that's far beyond my personal religious experience. This linguistic theory about cannabis, that's not my religion. This is just stuff that I've come across and collected. You know what I mean? It has nothing to do with my personal journey or experience, and I wouldn't expect anybody to believe that based on that. You know what I mean? It's like, that's just my personal experience.
So I definitely have some more questions, but does anyone else in the audience have any questions?
Did he find any evidence to the contrary in his research?
Were you able to hear that?
Like contrary of what, there's
Like,
definitely many theories about like cannabosum, you know what I mean? It's like, it was translated as calamus in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Bible. Many Hebrew scholars didn't believe the calamus suggestion, and a variety of things have been suggested. Camel grass, lemongrass, sugar cane. There's probably like a half a dozen to a dozen different candidates for this these references to Canada and cannabosum that have been suggested, and it would have been stuck there had not this archaeological evidence been done. But it is important. Like, I read a lot of critical articles on other people's research. You know what I mean? And I would say I've learned more from the people that have been critical of me than those who just blindly support me. Because then once somebody pokes a hole in your theory, either you got to patch that hole, or you got to adjust. You got to figure out, well, then that can't be right. I'm definitely always, I've gotten into a debate with Dan McClellan, a well-known biblical scholar. I've gotten into debate, with Professor Zohar Amar in Israel, a botanical writer, and I have on my blogs there what they said and how I respond, and going over point by point. You can take a look at that type of stuff on my blog, which is in there. Which has that as well. I've written critical articles on the immortality key, Brian Marescu's book. I've written critical articles on the psychedelic gospels by Professor Jerry Brown. I think a lot of the mushroom stuff, like John Allegro's stuff, Jerry Brown stuff, is just bunk. And I go over in detail why I think it's crap. You know what I mean? And I think that, that's a problem with psychedelic history and people writing psychedelic history. I think 90% of it, even maybe 95% of it, is quackery and doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And one of the things I like about cannabis is there's some really great archaeological evidence that you can back it up with. And as a word, it's so ancient that there's actual ancient textual references that are accepted as cannabis. And a lot of my research is just based on that type of stuff, archaeological and well-established linguistic evidence.
So I'll just ask another of my questions. You definitely touched a lot on the scientific side of like how they determined that this chemical residue was from a cannabis plant or from hashish. But and you also talked a bit about the linguistic side, but could you go into a bit more depth about like the background of who who is responsible for kind of creating this point in history that we can look back to? I'm referencing Sula Bennett.
Oh, Sula Bennett. What do you mean, like her personal life, or?
Well, but also like the time frame in which her research came out.
Okay, it came out in 1936 initially. But there's, interestingly, because there was no internet back then, people sometimes somebody could be working on similar halfway across the world. You never find out about each other. But in our time period, we have access to this wide variety of material through the internet. So there were other people writing about similar linguistic theories involving this term kana and cannabis. And in Phoenicia, which was close to the Hebrew culture, there's also people writing that the term kana was used there as well, right? Before her even. And other surrounding areas, we see this term kana coming up again, as well as it's thought to have been the term that came with the Scythians into the Mideast from the Bactria margiana archaeological complex, because one of the early Zoroastrian names was Kana as well. And this is like the same with the Assyrian term. Kanabu is just another linguistic development of this same term in a different area and a similar use, right? But she wrote about it again in her life, 1975, and she had a big article in Cannabis and Culture by another anthropologist, Vera Rubin. It's unfortunate that she didn't live to see this archaeological evidence at Tel Arad, Jerusalem. Unfortunately, it came out like right in the peak of COVID in 2020. And although it did get a bit of press, it got surprisingly overlooked. And there hasn't been that much commentary on it by scholars. But you could go to the museum in Jerusalem, and they have the actual altar reconstructed right there, and they refer to the cannabis resins in it. It's not like it's not unknown. They definitely know about it, and it's not any sort of radical theory. It's a well-established fact that these altars had cannabis resins burnt on them, and it fits seamlessly with these references to kana, because we see something that would have been at one time holy and then became prohibited because of its association with this goddess Ashra.
Yeah, just to clarify a bit more, I meant more so, and I mean, great answer, but regarding like the political atmosphere and like the timing, given that she published in, was it, you said 36, and then?
Yeah, well, she's a Jewish person in Poland in 1936. She came to America. I think her parents were killed by the Nazis. She's a woman writing at that time, which was, pretty radical to be an academic anthropologist and stuff in the 1930s in Eastern Europe. But she was pulling that off. I'm not really sure what I could say beyond that.
Yeah. I'm talking specifically regarding the criminalization of cannabis a year after her research was published, and then also like.
Oh, I don't think that's related.
Well,
She's
yeah.
over. It wasn't even translated into English by that time.
Oh, yeah. I wasn't suggesting that it was connected, more so just that, the fact that she published it then, but then also how that was really the start of it just happened to be around that time that there was a start of almost like demonization of it, especially after World War II, because of the whole hemp for victory thing, where they had to kind of agree with it for a bit.
Yeah, well, cannabis had a rich history in the 19th century in America, and one of the most important figures, I think, in the 19th century was a black dude, Dr. Pascal Beverly Randolph, who was also a sex magician and Rosicrucian, but he was a peddler of cannabis medicines with his Native American wife, Mary Jane. He's a fascinating guy, man. He's like super cool and had a variety of elixirs that he was peddling. I would say that cannabis prohibition in the United States has to do with racism. It was like breaking down racial barriers. They were using a lot of cannabis at jazz clubs. Blacks and whites were fraternizing together, dancing together, enjoying joints together. And this made a lot of people really uptight. And the initial reefer madness stuff was all focused on that. You can go back and read it. You know what I mean? It's like definitely based on racial ideas. The people, were growing hemp, but they didn't even realize the marijuana. They used the Spanish name marijuana because it kind of created a disassociation from cannabis medicines, which were also widespread used before Prohibition for a variety of things, from coughs to corn bunions. I put a museum collection together in the early 2000s, and there was just so many types of different cannabis medicine bottles from that time period. So uterine contractions, cough medicines, corn and bunion patches containing cannabis indica, just a whole host of medical things. And people that were using those, they didn't even realize the stuff they were reading about in the paper, marijuana, was the same thing. And so they railroaded this through using racism was the main drive of it. And then the Second World War started, and all of a sudden they needed parachutes and ropes and shit. And they're like, we need hemp. And they got a documentary film, Hemp for Victory, encouraging farmers. They had a whole campaign to encourage farmers to start growing hemp for the war efforts, promised them a whole new industry after the war. War ended, they took it away again. And it kind of got forgotten about. You know what I mean? I'd smoked marijuana for decades before I found out about this whole industrial history of hemp.
And if you were to speculate on why, I mean, given that it's speculation, but what are like the possible reasons that there was this, institutional push against it?
Well, Jack Herer's theory was that DuPont had recently, discovered the ways to make plastic and other things from petroleum fuel, and that there was a whole conspiracy by him and the banker. Just trying to remember his name. Oh man, I forget his name. He had newspapers. He was a newspaper.
Randolph Hearst.
Yeah, Randolph Hearst. Yeah. He had, lots of timber holdings and stuff, and paper was made from the timber and stuff, and that there was a conspiracy to suppress hemp and replace it with these petroleum products and wood products. I don't know if I'm a believer in Jack's theory. When they first discovered the petroleum, there wasn't all these ideas that it was going to be this environmental catastrophe. They just thought there was this endless supply of this goop here. Look at all this stuff we can make from this goop. This is great. And it was an endless supply, and no farm product could compete with this seemingly endless supply of goop. I think it was just kind of the way it went, and that the prohibition itself had much more to do with racism.
I had a question.
Mhm.
So combining all the information that is like theory about cannabis history and religious scripts and actual like archaeological evidence that like they 100% ingested cannabis. How much of it is like theory versus like actual evidence?
Well, actual evidence, say in the Hebrew thing, is Telarat, where we have and that's the only temple site that we have, right? And the linguistic theory of cannabis is a theory. I'm saying that the archaeological evidence is confirmation of the linguistic theory. You'd have to take a look in detail at how I've laid it out in written form and going over the comparisons and stuff like that, right? Now, in Hinduism, for instance, it's like, it's well known, like they're still smoking chillums right now. Today, there's people, over a million, I'm sure, at the Mahashivaratri. The Mahashivaratri is the largest human gathering in the world. That's been going on for centuries. And there's like literally people are drinking bong and smoking chillum all over it. It's like a huge part of it. All those long-haired, dreaded sadhus, this is their life, man. They like partake of ganja and then they do their yoga asanas. That's just historical fact. And the textual references to cannabis in India and Indian literature, there's no debate about that. That's a fact, Assyrian references to Kanabu. This is well established that these were references to cannabis by Assyriologists. It's not my opinion. This is something Assyriologists have written about. And in relation to Ishtar and Ishera and Inanna, there's actual textual references to Kanaba being brought to their temples and how much was brought and surviving references to it, right? In Buddhism, the texts I'm talking about are actual texts. Like, it's not my interpretation that there's one hemp seed a day before the Bodhi tree. There's like 2,000-year-old texts that refer to that, and 10th century Tibetan Buddhist texts and stuff, right? I tried to stick, like when it comes to Christianity, that's more speculation based on this earlier evidence, right? Like it's still far from proven. I think I make a really good case for it, right? And if you Google Jesus cannabis, there's been like so many news articles and magazine articles and shit written about it. It's an idea of mine that actually got away from me, like it became its own thing. It got memeified, and now I just see it turning up all over the place. A lot of times I'm not even referenced in it anymore, even though it was my original idea. So that's more speculation. And I try really hard in my books to clarify speculation from actual concrete evidence. You know what I mean? If I'm speculating, I'll make it clear that I'm speculating and what I'm seeing here and what it's based on, and I'll be real clear on where information is coming from, whether from archaeological sites or anthropologists or whoever. It's all like my books have like 30-page bibliographies. You know what I mean? Like I'm pretty careful about it because I'm open to criticism, man. You know what I mean? I'm trying to make a solid case and trying to make work that stands up to criticism.
Okay. Yeah, that's awesome. I have another question as well. You brought up the burning bush, but it was very brief.
That's like speculation, right? You know what I mean? That's not, you can't prove that. Moses heard the voice of God from within a burning bush. And we see this also in a later biblical account. Ezra as well has a similar experience. And there's this whole two different scholars, more than a century apart, have suggested that Ezra drank a cannabis-infused wine. And he had been a vassal of the Zoroastrians, who were the ones that drank these cannabis-infused wines. And then he came back over to the Holy Land when the Persians returned Jews back to the place. And so there's this whole idea that he had, there's an event where he describes drinking fire in a cup. And he has a huge vision and stuff. And he's largely credited with putting the Old Testament books together in the order that they're in. But I don't know if that's reliable history or myth.
Okay. So I've heard this before, and I'm guessing it's just like completely made up, but I've heard that there might have been like DMT in the bush. I think it's so unlikely, but
Well, this is like, okay, goes back to Benny Shannon, who died recently, Professor Benny Shannon. I brought him over to Vancouver for a conference in 2003. I didn't mention it, but I had a shop in Vancouver for 20 years called the Urban Shaman. And I sold ayahuasca, peyote, and everything openly in a store, and managed to get away with it for about 20 years. And then finally kind of had too many hassles with Health Canada that I decided to shut it down and retire. But I was also, put on conferences and stuff when I was there. And we brought Benny Shannon over, and he had a theory on it. He based this on his own experience with ayahuasca. Like this, there's this idea about the acacia bush, which acacia bark has DMT in it, and acacia appears in the Bible. My view is that every reference to acacia in the Bible is a reference to hardwood. And it's used for temple implements and stuff like that. I don't think that the DMT, and it's a speculative theory, and it doesn't have the archaeological, I would say even the linguistic theory for Cannabis was stronger, because we had the more established use in Assyria and Babylon of a knabu in an identical manner in temple worship. It was one of the items for the sacred rites in Assyrian literature, it says specifically. And it was used in infusions, ointments, and incense. But even before Telerat, I think that the Cannabis was a better theory than the acacia one, because there's just no indication that they had the knowledge to prepare the DMT from it, or that they were. I don't think.
So I was wondering, given the kind of like the collective forgetting that happened with a lot of these monotheistic religions regarding the identity of the cannabism and its, relation to cannabis, why do you think there's still been so much pushback, like even separate from even identifying it with that, but just pushback in general from a lot of traditional religious communities against cannabis use in general, except for now, like there's a lot more acceptance, and there always has been some level of acceptance for like medical use.
Yeah,
but kind of now
that's more
with
recent.
increasing
I think prohibition has its roots in, the Garden of Eden story and the forbidden fruit and devil's weed. That's even, it was even like, has been used in Reefer Madness days, devil's weed, it's like, it's because people smoke the marijuana and they start questioning the church. You know what I mean? Like, oh, I don't know about that anymore. I maybe think this now. It kind of like offers you a new way of looking at things. You know what I mean? You take a drug, and all of a sudden you got this whole new perspective on looking at it from over here instead of over here now, and kind of like is a threat to that. Religion and Christianity, these things are about faith, and this was the big issue in early Christianity when I talked about all these different religious groups in early Christianity, these variety of sects now collectively known under the banner of Gnosticism. And again, this is all stuff. It's not stuff my theories. You can look up about these Gnostics and all this early Christianity stuff. This is well established. Some are full-on sex cults as well in early Christianity. People don't know about it, but scholars know about it. There's actual texts and references. Google the question of Mary and see what that crazy text is about. There's lots of crazy stuff there. I kind of forgot where I was going with that. But what was the question again?
Basically,
why they were kind of prohibited. Yeah. So it's like faith versus knowledge. So these Gnosticism, that's what it means, is knowledge. They were all about having an experience yourself, whereas religion is more about faith. We're going to read you to the book. You go by what happened in the book. Your own experience is nothing. It's like what's written in there. And this was a transition that happened as well. When cannabis was prohibited and the Asher was prohibited and all the prophets that would have these wild revelations were prohibited, and monotheism took root in a book of laws. You know what I mean? Exodus, Numbers, these are all rules, man. That's the basis of it. This is what you do. It's not like this is how you have a religious revelation of your own. That's for sure.
also kind of going on Ada's question regarding, you know, like how much of this is like, do we know for certain? I was thinking, could you maybe mention some of like the material culture, like the evidence that we have that cannabis was used throughout history by different communities, but specifically what's coming to mind is like the Hassasat soror and the Passover one, or the Tizzalik.
Oh,
Or-
man, I'm not
like the different ways that at least the Jewish community continue to use cannabis throughout the ages.
Yeah, well, there's like references, you know, like in Kabbalah, like uh, um, you know, that people think there maybe the Kabbalists were using it and stuff. There's like Talmudic reference, I think, to the Babylonian broth, which was a cannabis porridge, you know, which was supposed to give you some sort of revelation. But you know, in a lot of the magic stuff and alchemy stuff, that's all kind of starts with Judaism. Like we know that Jewish alchemists were using cannabis from text translated by Raphael Patai. And we know like Sefer Raziel, Liber Salomonis, these are all based on Jewish magic and things. And this is one of the references to the cannabis ointment for mirror scrying. So there's that type of stuff, you know what I mean? Quintessences, magical use. I'm not really sure what you're getting at beyond that.
Oh, I mean, like in this case, I was specifically referring to like the Passover wine that was made by Persian.
Oh, okay. This is something
Yeah.
Emmanuel Lowe wrote about. Yeah. He described a wine that had Hassasat soror infused into it for a Passover wine, and Hassasat is a name of hashish, and soror I think means essence or something like that, and so it would have been a cannabis infused wine. But that's like, I don't know anything about it beyond that reference to Emmanuel Lowe, you know, that he refined. He was like a rabbi that was really into botany and wrote Die Flower der Juden, the plants of the Jews, and that reference appears in there.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Cannabis infused wines were quite popular. You know what I mean? There's numbers of archaeological sites. I referred to that Spanish 5,000-year-old Spanish one. There's a French archaeological dig from, I think, about 100 BCE, where they found cannabis infused wine. There's an Egyptian where cannabis was identified in a wine amphora. And there's those Scythian ones where the golden goblets had both cannabis and opium residues in it. And there's, you know, the numbers of textual references. The first anesthetic was actually a cannabis-infused wine in the 1st century in China, and it was used for a variety of operations to knock people out.
Okay, do you think there's a use of these? Do you think the use of these substances influence like spiritual experiences or perceptions?
Absolutely. You know, like cannabis in the occult period, like in the 19th, 20th century, was used for astral traveling. I have this book here, Sanctuary of Spiritualism. And this was written in 1850 by this guy, Louis Alphonse Gagné, another Rosicrucian guy. And it's like 15 firsthand accounts of people ingesting like 3 grams of hashish and coffee. And that's a big thing here. Like, you know, we're used to more cannabis, more of a recreational thing, casually puffing with our friends and that sort of thing. Now that people are getting into edibles, you're starting to see situations where people have more powerful experiences. But this was like 3 grams of gooey Islamic hashish mixed into coffee, and people were having really powerful out-of-body experiences. And Cagné thought, and you can find this on Google Books, you can actually get the actual text, Sanctuary of Spiritualism by Cagné. And people had like really powerful out-of-body experiences, past life experiences. And Cagné thought there was going to be a whole new religion identified out of this. Crowley as well. He had had his first experience of samadhi under the influence of hashish, and was convinced that would be a whole thing. Here's another, like, this is a book from 1895, Key for Life Story in 9 Phases. And it's all about hashish astral traveling under the influence of hashish. It's beautifully illustrated, but it's like a story about an artist who starts astral traveling with this guy's wife that he's painting and having an affair with her on the astral plane. But I'll try to find a couple of the illustrations in it and stuff. It shows them tripping on hash and stuff. But it's a beautiful little book from 1895. And there's other books from this time period as well, all about people having powerful visionary experiences on cannabis. Sufis, they definitely would take really potent amounts of hashish ingested and had all sorts of mystical experience. So, a big thing that was sought after by Sufis was like obliterating your ego and getting down to an experience of just pure consciousness, oneness with the universe. And this is what samadhi is as well. And, a lot of Freemasons as well were messing with cannabis in the 19th century. I covered a lot of that stuff in my book, Liber 420.
Do you think the use of these substances can open one up to spiritual deception or demonic influence?
Well, I don't believe in discarnate entities myself, right? Like demons or angels or anything like that. My cosmology is we're all part of a collective consciousness, and that collective consciousness can have archetypes and symbols and things through which it contacts us and interacts with us. And I think that what cannabis does is and other psychedelics as well, it can put you into contact with aspects of the subconscious, the unconscious. Now, Carl Jung, like the subconscious, the unconscious is a lot of like our early programming that's not like put into word memories, but it influences us, our relationship with our mother and how that influences us and things like that. But Carl Jung thought there was a deeper level of this. He's a famous psychologist, which he referred to as the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious is, he said, is what would be referred to as instinct in animals. And instinct, what's that? Like a deer can get up and walk around the day it's born. A sea elephant can go catch a fish the day it's born. Many animals are born with a certain awareness and intelligence, and this is genetically passed down. And these other mammals, we have the same sort of brain system as them. We have this aspect of our consciousness which would be interwound with instinct and instinctual function and genetic memory and stuff, right? It's the experience of our ancestors passed down, right? And there's an element of collectivity to this. You see flocks of birds, schools of fish, crowd hysteria, that sort of thing. And I think that cannabis can help you get into contact with this aspect of collective unconsciousness, and some psychedelics through the effect on the pineal gland, which is thought to be interwound with instinctual function, right? Which is like the genetic memory of the species, right? And for me, I think that's where real spirituality takes place. You know what I mean? Theoretically, if we have a genetic memory of the species, this goes back through further to the evolutionary chain and the origins of life. And by getting into these lower levels of consciousness beyond our thoughts and memories and personal experience, we might be able to tap into something more universal.
So kind of going on that last question, and also kind of tying it or like grounding it within the, the world that like most of the world, acknowledges. I was thinking, could you maybe address the Old Man of the Mountain and the Hashishins, given how they did use cannabis in a way that could be considered indoctrinatory?
Well, like there's the myths about the Hashishins, like hashish and assassin are thought to come from the same root, Hashishin. And the legend, brought back by Marco Polo, and there was another guy before him that brought back this similar story. I forget his name, another European traveler. Was that the old man would seek out devotees and drug them with hashish, and they would wake up inside this beautiful garden, which was inside his temple up on a mountain, his castle up on a mountain, and they'd be, surrounded by naked houris, women and they believed that they had died and gone to paradise, you know, and then he would drug them again, and they would wake up, and he'd say, see, I've shown you paradise. Now, if you ever want to return there, you must serve me, you know, and they would be so devoted to him that they'd be willing to die, you know, like a big army shows up at his castle, and they go, oh, we're coming. And he goes, oh, yeah, well, you're never going to be able to fight my men. And they go, what do you mean? And he points up to the castle, and he beckons somebody, and they step off and drop to their death. And he's like, they're all willing to die for me because they believe they're going to go to paradise. This is a story brought back by Marco Polo. The reality is probably more like these individuals were considered heretics by the larger kingdoms around them. And this may all have something to do with the esoteric use of cannabis in Islam, which may go back to Muhammad. We know that there was a sacred drink that was drank at Mecca that contained cannabis, you know, early on in the early part of the Islamic religion. And there's some evidence that Muhammad himself partook of this. And I went over some of the Dabistan and some of this other stuff that refers to Muhammad's own use. So they were heretics, and so more likely they knew that they couldn't battle the much larger kingdoms, you know, these huge armies and the Crusaders and stuff like the Templars and stuff, who also have an interesting history of cannabis. And so they would infiltrate the king's service people, you know, his workers and stuff inside the temple, and they'd have somebody that was in there for a couple of years that was so accepted, and one day the sultan who was threatening him would wake up with a note with a knife in the pillow saying, you better back off, we could kill you anytime. And it was like a way of fighting back against these much larger kingdoms without having to have the armies in order to do it. And the cannabis use itself was probably more of an esoteric element of initiation, used much like the Sufis and dervishes for mystical enlightenment rather than for inspiring battle. Although cannabis does have a history in warfare. In Sikh religion, the 10th guru of Sikhism was apparently high on bhang when he rode into battle on an elephant in a victorious battle. And the Nihang Sikhs, who are the traditional guardians of the Sikh temple, they still partake of cannabis in rituals and refer to it as sukkadun. And they prepare it in these wild rituals with giant mortars and huge bowls. If you Google Nihang and cannabis, you'll find some great video of them preparing cannabis and drinking cannabis and stuff, the Nihang Sikhs. Zulu warriors as well were, you know, known to partake of cannabis before going into battle. So there is some evidence. And Scythians were pretty fierce warriors as well that used cannabis. So there is some indications that the warrior classes use it. And in modern MMA, you know, the fighting stuff that's all going on, there is a lot of potheads. It's not just Joe Rogan, man. They have whole tournaments where people fight and even win cannabis and stuff like that. There's such a big scene of pot in the MAA scene or whatever. I don't know if it's MAA or whatever it is. Not my trip, but it's there.
Yeah, so we have to start finishing up, but does anyone have any last questions? Well, I'll just ask my last question. I think it's a good tie together. So you've written a bit about her, but if you could just quickly address Seyshot and how cannabis isn't just associated with, you know, this culture of how, you know, the West tends to see it as, you know, recreationally or like, you know, something that causes stupor, but how it's also associated with a tradition of scholarship.
You said Seyshot, though, like the Egyptian goddess. I'm not sure how that ties into what else.
Oh. Well, she was the goddess of hemp, but also the goddess of, I think, writing. I might be wrong.
Well, Seyshot, you know, like building and stuff like that. Well, there's this like she has a symbol over her head, which many people have interpreted as a cannabis leaf. Some Egyptologists say it's like a star or something like that, but it looks very much like a cannabis leaf. Traditionally, you know, in Egypt, it's thought that cannabis was known as Shem Shemet, and it's thought to have just been used medicinally as the general view of Egyptologists. Now, there's other references that indicate it might have been burnt as an incense, but it's kind of written in the text that's referred to is kind of written in a more esoteric manner, so it's not like as clear as that. And there's things like Nepenthe, which was an infused wine of some sort, which many scholars believe was a cannabis infused wine. And there's other things, but a lot of the evidence, I would say, for ritual use in Egypt lays on the speculative end rather than the firmly documented end that the medical texts are, which are really specific recipes and specifically identify cannabis. It's not got the same sort of thing. And I would say that's what scholars would tell you, is that, well, there's really solid evidence here of medical use. Ritual use is left to speculation somewhat.
I was specifically actually referring to the hemp fiber, like its usage. Was it ever used to make papyrus, for instance? Do we know about that?
I don't know of anything. They found like hemp fiber on one of the mummies, like a hemp little ball of hemp fiber in one of the mummies. But the linen that it was covered in, they were more into flax and stuff like that. I don't know of any like. Cannabis was used by the Egyptians because they've done like soil strata and stuff, and it appears in the soil strata going way back. And there's a couple of different finds like that hemp fiber ball in the mummy that goes back some centuries. There was claims of deep tissue cannabis, from doing a deep tissue analysis of a mummy that they used cannabis, but the same deep tissue analysis also identified the use of coca and tobacco, which are New World plants, and led to this whole claim that there was agent trade between South America and Egypt, which is pretty, it's more likely people made mistakes or something's turning up as something else in analysis, you know what I mean? And so because the cannabis is in those same studies as this coca and tobacco, it's not considered, it's caught up in the controversy that the evidence for the coca and tobacco is.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been absolutely amazing. And do you have a YouTube channel that we can link to, or like anything? I know you put the link to
Yeah,
your
I've got my blog up there. That's probably the best place. That's where a lot of articles, like when I post the stuff or responding to something written about me or something like that, that goes up. You'll find a variety of articles there, including critical articles of some of the other people writing about this type of stuff. And I've also provided a link in the chat for my books. And if you Google my name and cannabis in YouTube, you can find all sorts of interviews and lectures and things like that as well. I've got a few documentaries on there. One on Agent Grace called Smoke of the Oracles, one on Cannabis, some other ones as well. But if you Google my name and cannabis, all that stuff should show up on YouTube.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. I really appreciate you doing Zoom with us today.
Hey, great. Thanks for having me. Take care. And feel free you can find me on Facebook or Instagram if you have any questions or you're looking for some sort of specific information. Feel free to shoot me a question and I'll try to provide you the information.
Awesome. We will link you on our Instagram so that people can ask.
Take care.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Have a good one.
You bet.
The recording has stopped.